Montana Territory, July 1882. The first time Adam Elroy saw her, she was half hidden behind the smoke of a burning barn, a rifle in her hands and blood on her cheek. The fire had jumped from the dry grass to the structure fast, and Adam, passing through with a wagon full of fencing wire, had pulled hard on his reins when he saw the flames curling up into the sky. He had not expected to find anyone alive. But there she stood, barefoot in the dirt, eyes sharp as glass. "Get back," she yelled, coughing through the smoke. "There's still kerosene in the shed." Adam jumped down from the seat and grabbed the water barrel from the back of his wagon. "I ain't leaving you in it," he shouted. She hesitated, eyes flicking between him and the barn. Then she cursed under her breath and ran toward the side where the fire burned hottest. He saw the scars when her sleeve slid back smooth, white burns that wrapped around her arm and disappeared beneath her collar. Later, when the fire was out and the sun had gone down low over the hills, she sat on a fallen beam, her skirts singed and her face streaked with soot. Her hands trembled, but her mouth was set firm. "Name's Eve Archer," she said quietly. "My brother's family used to own this land. He's gone now." "So's his wife." Adam nodded. "Adam Elroy." She looked up at him and her eyes were brown and tired. "You got somewhere to be, Mr. Elroy." He looked out over the scorched field, then back at her. "Not tonight." The town of Barlow Ridge sat 10 miles west. He brought her there the next morning after she buried what little was left of the animals and packed up a bag with what she could save. "People here know you?" he asked as they rolled into town. Her jaw tensed. "They know me." That afternoon, as Eve stood outside the general store inspecting the cost of nails and kerosene, Adam overheard 2 women whispering behind him near the feed sacks. "That's the cursed one," one hissed. "The Archer girl. Her whole family burned in that house fire when she was 16. She was the only one lived. Some say it was her fault." "Look at her face," the other said. "You can still see the scars." Adam turned to them. "You two always speak this loud about strangers." They blinked and walked off without another word. That night, Eve stayed at the livery loft, curled up in the hay with a rifle beside her. Adam slept in the wagon. They worked the land together. Adam had not planned to stay in Montana long, but by the end of the second week he had built her a new shed, patched her roof, and put up a fence around the vegetable patch. "You do not have to keep fixing things," she said one evening, wiping sweat from her brow. He sat across from her on the porch, boots kicked up on the railing. "I want to." Eve looked at him a long time. "You do not look at me like they do." "How do they look at you?" "Like I walked out of a grave." Adam set his coffee down. "You walked out of fire. That is not cursed." "That's brave." She turned her face away, but her shoulders softened. One morning 2 children ran up the path, dusty, skinny, and sunburned. 1 boy, 1 girl. Eve dropped her hoe and ran to them. "Gideon," she gasped, falling to her knees. "Aunt Eve," the boy cried, clutching her. "We've been hiding in the trees behind the creek. The man who came last winter, he came back. He took the mule and ran off. We waited, but no one came. We were scared." Eve held them tight. "You are safe now, both of you." That night they slept curled together in the loft. Adam sat with Eve outside, watching the stars. "You did not say your niece and nephew were out there," he said gently. "I did not know if they made it. My brother sent them away when the fire started, told them to run. I thought." She trailed off. "You thought they were gone." She nodded, eyes shining in the dark. Adam reached over and took her hand. "They are not." She looked down at their joined hands, then up at him. "You keep showing up when no one else will." He squeezed her fingers. "I am not going anywhere." The next week, word spread through town that the land Eve claimed was being contested by a cattleman from East Texas who said he had deed rights. They came for her at dusk, 3 of them on horseback, loud and laughing. They knocked over her fence and scared the children half to death. Adam was there before they reached the porch. "You are on private property," he said coldly, rifle in hand. The lead man spat. "This land is not hers. She has no husband, no claim, no protection." Adam stepped forward. "She does now." He turned to Eve, heart pounding. "If you will have me, I will stand with you, before man, before God." Her eyes filled. "You do not have to do this, Adam." "I want to." She stared at him, breathing hard. Then she reached for his hand, voice steady. "Yes." The next morning, in a small white church with peeling paint and wildflowers in a jar on the altar, Eve Archer became Eve Elroy. The children stood beside them, holding hands. And when Adam said wife, he meant it with every part of his soul. The sound of the rooster was faint against the wide hush of morning. Sunlight hadn't yet reached the tops of the cottonwoods, but the stove inside the cabin was already warm, and the smell of cornmeal frying floated soft in the air. Eve stood at the hearth, hair braided back, an apron tied around her waist. Her hands moved without hurry, measured and sure. Adam sat nearby, brushing out his coat with a damp cloth, his boots clean for the first time in weeks. "You think the fence'll hold through August?" Eve asked without turning. "Depends if the river stays in its banks. If it floods again, we'll need to move the south posts up the incline." She nodded. "I figured as much." Gideon came in carrying the wood bucket, his arms barely wide enough to circle it. He set it by the stove with a grunt, then looked up at Adam. "I saw a snake this morning," he said. "Dead one, head cut clean off. You leave it where it lay, buried it. Didn't want Ruth to find it." Adam gave a small nod. Smart thinking. The girl, still rubbing sleep from her eyes, curled up near the fire. Eve knelt beside her and brushed the hair from her face. "You hungry?" Ruth nodded, her cheek pressed against her aunt's knee. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and damp soil. The land was still raw from the last storm, the far hills streaked with runoff. Eve had started setting aside jars for pickling, knowing the garden wouldn't carry them through winter alone. Later that day, Adam rode out with Gideon to check the pasture. The boy rode bareback on the old mare, who barely moved faster than a walk. "When's a horse too old to work?" Gideon asked, his voice serious. Adam studied the sun-cracked ground ahead. "When she's too tired to lift her head by morning, or when she stops answering you." The boy frowned. "She still listens, just slow." "That's enough for now." They rode in silence for a stretch, the only sound the creak of saddle leather and the soft snort of the mare. "Do you think she's all right?" Gideon asked suddenly. Adam looked over. "Who? Aunt Eve. She don't cry, not even when she cuts herself or gets burned on the stove. But sometimes, when she thinks no one's looking, she just sits quiet for a long time." Adam pulled the reins and stopped. "Your aunt's had to carry more than most. But she's strong. You know how a tree bends in the wind so it don't break?" Gideon nodded. "She's like that. Doesn't mean she ain't tired sometimes." Back at the cabin, Eve was mending a broken hinge on the chicken coop. Ruth sat nearby, humming to a cloth doll missing one arm. "Town council's meeting next week," Eve said as Adam stepped down from the saddle. "Gerald Firth means to bring up the claim again." Adam unbuckled his rifle and leaned it against the porch rail. "He'll bring it up every week till someone tells him to stop." She stood, brushing rust from her palms. "I'll go. I want them to see I won't be run off." He met her eyes. "I'll go with you. I didn't ask you to. You don't have to." That night the children slept in the loft while Eve and Adam sat by the hearth. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the floor. Eve stitched a patch onto Gideon's trousers, her needle moving steady. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, eyes on the fabric. "I used to." "What made you stay?" He paused. "You," She didn't look up, but the thread slipped slightly in her fingers. "I'm not always easy to be around." "I don't need easy," he said. "I need true." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the moon rose through silver clouds, and the air was warm with the scent of clover and smoke. Eve folded the trousers and set them aside. Her face was still, unreadable, but her hand reached for his, and they sat like that until the flames died down to embers. The church bell rang once, low and hollow across the open land, as Eve stepped down from the wagon in front of the meeting hall. Her dress was plain, but the collar was starched and her boots polished. Ruth stayed with the schoolmarm for the afternoon, while Gideon had stubbornly insisted on accompanying them, sitting quiet between Adam and the wagon wall, his knees pulled to his chest. The townsfolk were gathered in uneven clusters, some standing, some seated on rough benches inside. As Eve entered, the chatter thinned. No one spoke directly to her, but the hush said enough. Councilman Latham cleared his throat. "We've convened regarding the disputed acreage north of the creek bend. Mr. Firth has presented his claim, though the matter remains unsettled." Eve stepped forward before Firth could rise. "You've all heard his side," she said, voice steady. "But I've worked that land with my own hands. My brother left it to me, and I've no intention of yielding it because I lack a man's name on the deed." Firth stood, tipping his hat back slightly. "Miss Archer, Elroy," Adam said from the back. Firth's face twitched. "Mrs. Elroy, then." "You'll excuse me if I question the timing of your union." Adam came forward, gaze fixed. "Question what you like, but the work's been hers since long before I set foot in this town." A murmur rose, but no one interrupted. Eve met Firth's eyes. "You want to claim land, you do it the right way. Not by sending men at dusk to tear down fences." Latham raised a hand. "Enough. If Mr. Firth has no legal document filed or witnessed, this council sees no cause to remove Mrs. Elroy from her homestead." A woman in the back stood slowly. Her hair was gray, pinned tight, and her apron stained with flour. "I saw her pulling her brother's children from the creek after the fire. I saw what she carried back to that farm. If scars make a woman unfit, then half the mothers here ought to be turned out too." No one answered her. Outside, the sky had turned overcast. As they stepped back into the street, Eve's fingers brushed Adam's. "I wasn't sure they'd listen." "They didn't have to," he said. "You already won." They rode back in silence, Gideon half asleep against the wagon side. The wind carried the smell of damp earth, and somewhere far off, a hawk called out over the ridge. That night, Eve stayed up after the children had gone to bed, drying herbs near the stove. Adam sat sharpening a blade on the porch, the sound slow and steady. She opened the door and leaned against the frame. "I think I'm getting used to quiet that isn't full of dread." He glanced over his shoulder. "Peace has a sound. You just forget it after a while." Eve stepped outside and sat beside him, close enough their shoulders touched. "I used to think I'd always be alone," she said. "That the fire didn't just take my family, it took the part of me that could trust anyone again." Adam set the knife down and turned toward her. "You don't owe me anything." "I know." She looked down at her hands, palms marked with old burns and calluses. "That's why I wanted to tell you." He didn't speak, just reached out and gently traced the edge of her wrist, where the skin was thinnest and the scar ran like a pale ribbon toward her thumb. "I never thought someone would look at me and not turn away. I never thought I'd find someone who'd fought harder than me just to stand upright." The wind shifted, cooler now as the fire inside crackled low. Eve leaned her head against his shoulder. "I want to build something real out of all this, not just survive, something that lasts." Adam pressed a kiss to the crown of her head, his voice low. "Then we'll build it. One day, one post, one harvest at a time. She breathed in deep, the scent of cedar and smoke and the leather of his coat grounding her. They sat that way until the moon passed overhead, and the stars turned in the sky, two people no longer waiting for the world to grant them peace, but making it with their own hands, side by side. By late September, the wind had changed. It came down from the north now, sharp with the scent of frost and dry pine, and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone amber and brittle. Eve pulled the last of the squash from the garden while Ruth gathered wind-fallen apples into her apron. The boy had taken to checking the trap lines before breakfast, always returning with muddy boots and a grin that reminded Eve too much of his father. Adam had begun splitting logs before dawn. His shoulder still ached from the fence post that had given under him the week before, but he said nothing of it. She only noticed when he favored his left side lifting the axe. "You'll feel that come November," she said, handing him a tin of salve warmed by the stove. "You ought to rest it a day." He rubbed the balm into his arm without answering. The silence between them had become something different now, less wary, more knowing. He didn't need to explain himself, and she didn't need to press. That evening, after the children had gone quiet upstairs, Eve unrolled the deed papers from the tin box under the floorboard. She smoothed them flat on the table, lantern light catching the faded ink. "You thinking of filing again?" Adam asked, wiping his hands on a rag. "I've read the statutes. Under the Homestead Act, a widow can claim if she's worked the land 5 years, but they don't speak to women who were never wives. You are now." Eve looked up. "You don't think it's dishonest?" "No more than a man claiming land he's never touched. We've built every inch of this place together." "That's your right." She folded the papers carefully and slid them back into the tin. "I want it in my name too," she said. "For them, if anything ever happens." He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing the inside of her wrist. "Then we'll make it right. Proper and recorded. No one'll question it twice." The next morning she rode into Barlow Ridge alone. He'd offered to go, but the livestock needed tending, and she knew how to speak for herself. She wore her father's old coat, the cuffs frayed, the collar patched with canvas. At the land office, the clerk blinked when she gave her name, but said nothing, only handed her the form and pointed to the inkwell. When she stepped back outside, the wind had picked up. She tied the papers down beneath the seat board and climbed onto the wagon. As she turned the mare toward home, she passed Martha Keene sweeping the stoop of the mercantile. The woman glanced up, startled. "I heard you'd married that wanderer," she said, lowering her broom. Eve stopped the mare, holding the reins loose in her lap. "He's got a name," she said. "And he's not wandering anymore." Martha shifted, brushing her hand against her apron. "Folks say a lot about what happened back then, about you." "I know what they say. They're wrong." Eve nodded once, then clicked her tongue and steered the mare onward. That night, Ruth brought in a bundle of dried sage from behind the shed. "I want to hang it above the door like Auntie said." Eve took the stems from her gently. "Then let's find a good bit of string." Adam was mending the harnesses by the fire. "That from your mother?" he asked. Eve looked up. "From mine, yes." He returned to his stitching, saying nothing more. But later, when she passed behind him to stir the coals, he lightly touched her waist just once, like a promise. As October neared, the first hard frost came sudden and mean. The pumpkins cracked in the field, and the hens stopped laying for a day. Eve brought in the last of the onions and hung them in the root cellar, her fingers stiff with cold. She and Adam took turns reading to the children at night. The Bible mostly. Sometimes the old book of fables her mother had kept wrapped in oilcloth. One night, as the fire burned low and the wind rattled the shutters, Gideon asked, "Was my father brave?" Eve set down her knitting, her mouth tightening. "He was," Adam said before she could speak. "He got you and your sister out when the smoke was thick. That takes more than bravery." "That's love." The boy nodded slowly, then lay back down, pulling the quilt to his chin. Later, after the children's breathing had evened, Eve and Adam sat in the dark, her head on his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "He didn't ask for what." Just reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, the scar there catching the faint light from the fire. He kissed her softly, and she let the weight she'd carried loosen just a little more. Here in this quiet, with the wind outside and the warmth of his hands at her back, she finally believed she belonged. The snow came early that year. By the second week of November, the fields were white, and the stream behind the barn had stilled beneath a skin of ice. Adam shoveled the path from the porch to the shed each morning before dawn, his breath visible in the gray light. Eve had finished curing the last cuts of venison, hanging them in the smokehouse with twine and care. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar, ash, and the bread she'd baked with the last of the summer flour. The children spent their afternoons with lessons at the table, and Eve had taken to teaching Gideon how to write in a steadier hand. Ruth had started stitching small squares of cloth together, a patchwork of old dresses and flour sacks. She said she meant to make a quilt for the baby doll Adam carved her from a pine branch. That morning, Eve had caught Adam watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. She'd been turning butter in the churn, her sleeves rolled up, and he'd stood in the doorway, his expression quiet but full. "You ever think about leaving it all behind?" he asked that evening as the fire threw long shadows across the floor. Eve glanced up from the mending basket. "When I was younger." "What stopped you?" She threaded the needle. "I didn't have anywhere better to go." Adam let the silence settle between them before he spoke again. "What if you could go anywhere now? What would you want?" Eve tied off the thread and looked at him, her face unreadable. "I'd want to stay, right here, with you." Adam leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking about building a new room off the back, something proper, not just a curtain between us and the children. Somewhere we could sit quiet like this, but not always beside the stove." Eve's eyes softened. "You want to start that in snow? I'll cut the lumber slow, piece by piece. We'll be ready by spring." She reached across and touched the edge of his sleeve. "Don't do it alone. I wouldn't know how anymore." The last of the mail from Fort Benton arrived 3 days before Christmas, bundled in oilcloth and tied with twine. There was a letter from a cousin of Eve's back east, someone she hadn't heard from in years. The handwriting was crooked, the paper yellowed with age. She read it twice by lamplight, then folded it and tucked it into the Bible. "I thought she was dead," she said, sitting beside Adam at the table. "Is she asking you to come?" "No, just wanted me to know she'd found a bit of peace. She never married. Lives in a boarding house near a river. Says she walks every morning." Adam didn't speak, just reached over and took her hand, the lines of his palm rough against hers. "I didn't think anyone remembered me from before," she said. "They did. They just didn't know how to say it." That night, snow fell in thick, silent drifts. Ruth curled against Eve's side and mumbled in her sleep about the apple tarts they'd made. Gideon had taken to sleeping with the pup they'd found half frozen under the porch 2 weeks prior. Adam reached out beneath the quilt, his fingers brushing Eve's wrist in the dark. "You sure?" he whispered. "About what? This life? All of it?" She turned toward him, her voice low and sure. "There's nowhere else I'd rather be." By early March, the thaw had begun. The new room was half-framed, the beams straight and strong. Gideon helped Adam carry the lumber, and Ruth had taken to singing while she swept the floor with a broom twice her height. One afternoon, as the sun broke through the clouds and turned the snowmelt to rivulets, Eve stood on the porch and watched Adam drive the last nail into the window frame. He looked up, caught her eye, and tipped his hat with a grin that reached all the way to his eyes. That night, they sat in the new room, unfinished but warm with the heat of the fire. Eve held her knitting while Adam read aloud from the old fable book, his voice low and even. The children lay curled on blankets near the hearth, the pup nestled between them. When the fire burned down to coals, Eve leaned back against Adam's chest, her hands resting on his. "I never thought peace would look like this," she said. "It doesn't look like anything," he murmured against her hair. "It just shows up quiet and stays when you let it." Outside, the moon hung full over the plains, casting long silver light across the snow-packed earth. Every window of the house glowed with warmth. Spring came slow but certain. The creek ran again and the garden rows were planted in neat lines. Ruth's quilt was nearly finished, lopsided but proud. Gideon's handwriting had steadied and he had begun carving figures beside Adam in the evenings. The new room was paneled by May, the windows trimmed in pine. One Sunday, they rode into town with the children dressed in their best. After service, the parson pulled Eve aside and asked if she'd consider teaching reading twice a week in the schoolhouse. She said yes without hesitation. As she and Adam climbed back into the wagon, she looked out over the hills, the land green and wide beneath the open sky. "I think we made something good here," she said. Adam reached for her hand. "We did more than that, we made it together." She leaned into his side, her voice low. "I love you, Adam Elroy." He turned to her, his thumb brushing the edge of her jaw. "I've loved you from the first time you stood in front of that fire and told me to get back." She laughed then, soft and full. And as they rode home, the sun warm against their backs and the children dozing beside them, Eve knew without any doubt that she had stepped not just out of the fire, but into the life she was always meant to find. A life built with weathered hands, steady hearts, and hard-earned gentleness. A life that would last.